Thank you. Our next question is from the Universidad Autónoma de Guadalajara in Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico.
Greetings to the panelists and everybody. Dr. Schultz, you said that the budgets for marketing are not always properly applied and sometimes are wasted. What are the most common errors as far as budget allocations? Or what ideas would you give us so that we could allocate the amounts in a proper way?
Well, I did cover that in my presentation, and of course advertising dollars or marketing dollars are very dear, and they have to be expended very cautiously and judiciously. And again, you have to research the marketplace, make sure you're targeting the right audience, and be very careful how you expend those dollars. I did cover that very carefully. And of course, if you wish further information, I would be very glad to correspond with you.
Thank you. Our next question is from the Universidad de Monterrey in San Pedro Garza Garcia in Nuevo León, Mexico.
Buenos días, adelante. Mr. Schultz has just said that the free market is the only guarantee for freedom and for justice to exist. But what we have experienced with this model has been a polarization and a greater abyss between wealth and poorness and poverty. So what is your opinion, Mr. Panelist, or for the panelists? What are your opinions?
Do you wish to answer that, or do you want? It was kind of directed to me, but do you have a response?
It's a difficult issue really to deal with, because what may mean when you open markets is, in essence, the people who are already powerful become more powerful, and I think that's something that can very easily can happen. I don't see why. That's why privatization and that's why opening markets has to be handled very carefully so that those particular kind of circumstances don't happen. That really involves in terms of the politics of your own particular country more than I think than anything else. I don't know if...
I do agree with that.
One of the things I wonder about
is
seriously though is where you have not seen the polarization happen.
I've never seen really a situation where polarization does not happen. This is always a byproduct of global marketing. Polarization will take place.
Our next question is from the Universidad Tecnológica de Tula Tepeji in Tula de Allende, Hidalgo, Mexico.
How can you define the proper vision that will allow us to, on the one hand, have a practical marketing system and that will enable us to train properly our people in order for them to face the global market?
How do I define vision? In this particular concept, I go to the definition of vision. That's foresight, looking ahead, benefiting from past mistakes that if you have not made, that others may have made, doing the same thing. Mistakes are not limited to the small businessman or the small business enterprise. Excuse me. I frequently look back on mistakes made, for example, by General Motors, certainly one of the largest organizations in the world. An example being when they tried to introduce a new model in South America of the Chevrolet called the Nova, and they couldn't understand why it wouldn't sell until someone informed them that Nova means won't go. So these are mistakes that even the large companies make. Pepsodent, who had a toothpaste, which I'm sure is known internationally, had a slogan, "You'll wonder where the yellow went." They use this slogan in Asia, where people are of a yellow skin. So don't be afraid to make a mistake, but don't make the same mistake twice if you can avoid it.
I think, too, you have to look at the example, I think, in terms of, for example, Compaq Computer Corporation. They had the vision of becoming more than just a hardware manufacturer and getting more into more profitable opportunities as far as making services concerned. The reason they did that is because they saw the opportunity. They didn't have the capability themselves, and so what they decided to do, instead of building internal capability, is that they bought Tandem Corporation, and they are in the middle of buying DAC at the same time. So it's a matter of having the will, having the means, but still having the opportunity out there to really to make something of.
Our next question should be in English from the Panama Canal Commission in Panama.
Yes, good morning.
Morning.
Our question is, Latin American countries are going through a process of privatization of government entities. However, end result is that basic services are going up in price. Telephone access is a good example which runs counter the Internet approach. What is your opinion on this subject?
Well, I have a very strong feeling about government participation in the business world. I believe that very much in laissez-faire. I know that the period of time that the United States had its greatest growth was after the Industrial Revolution, when we had a policy of allowing business to work freely in the marketplace. And I think that governments throughout the world, and this is becoming sort of philosophical here, but that governments throughout the world have got to understand that we are in a global world. We are no longer confined to our geographical boundaries. And the millennium will show more and more of that as we proceed into the next century. So it's, again, a political question whether governments will recognize the fact that we are participating in a global world. And, of course, my own hope and desire is that people will learn that if they can trade together, perhaps they will not be belligerent toward each other. And I think that is the future of the world and the future of any country.
And I think that you brought up really a key point in that, because if all that you're doing is privatizing a monopoly, I don't think you're going to be getting very far. I think that if you privatize an industry and introduce competition, perhaps from other international competitors, then prices will go down. I think that privatizing in and of itself may basically stop a money-using resource from draining government funds, but in and of itself, I don't think it will actually drop prices.
Next, we will hear a question from the Universidad Central de Venezuela in Caracas, Venezuela.
Quality versus quantity.
Thank you for this opportunity to ask this question. What is the importance of global marketing in the success of organizations, for educational organizations to have success? Particularly because their problem is, for the public universities, the big problem is training human resources. Thank you.
Would you like to respond to that from the educational standpoint?
Well, I think that you have several examples of that, really. I think you have the International Training Center as one example. I think you have Rice University as another example. I think you have Harvard University as a third example, on where portions of the university, that through extensions or some kind of foundation, have basically made almost for-profit opportunities as a result of that. And they have brought in some cases, significant dollars into their universities as a result. So I think that what educational and training opportunities you already make can be marketed to a fairly wide variety of people, both locally, nationally, and internationally.
Our final question will be from the Universidad Espíritu Santo in Guayaquil, in Ecuador.
From the University Espíritu Santo in Guayaquil, Ecuador, what are the parameters that you feel are necessary to define whether or not a company is competing on a global level? How can you define whether a company is competing on a global level or not? When can you really say the company is global? When it's doing what?
Mr. Schultz, take a shot at that.
Well, okay, I can take the reverse of that and say, when can we define when a company is not global? When you're not aware, I would say that you're a global company when you are aware of customs and marketing products that are in great demand internationally. And you can be a global company by just doing certain things within your own borders, because people today with television and with publications are becoming more and more aware of customs, traditions, fads, if you will have it, that are popular throughout the world. And our young people, who are our greatest buyers of new products and users of new products, are constantly looking outside of your own borders for new and exciting things.
And I would add to that something that what the head of ASEA Brown Boveri, perhaps one of the most internationally and culturally sensitive organizations in the entire world, said, is that as of now there is no such thing as a global company. Although we have our cultural sensitivities, and there really has not a truly global organization really has yet emerged. So I'm not sure if we can really fully answer that question until we have a few of them around to talk about.
Let us begin now with Module 2, in which Dr. Chaudron will present his ideas on strategic planning and the cultural considerations in market penetration.
Thank you for joining us today. During this video conference, we will be talking about two elements which are critical to the success of any organization in an increasingly global market: strategic planning and an understanding of the effect culture has on your attempts to successfully penetrate new markets. Other dimensions, such as the effect of demographics, team building, business and entrepreneurial systems, will be discussed in later video conferences. The last months of 1997 saw turmoil in Asia that has led to repercussions across the world. Once again, we see how integrated and global the world has become, where the initial stock market turmoil in Malaysia has led to severe economic turbulence for the rest of the Asian tigers. It has caused trouble in South American markets, has contributed to a reduction in interest rates in the United States, and has eviscerated the long-term plans of many a corporation. In addition to the initial turmoil that stock market gyrations normally cause, they also have revealed a troubled financial foundation of what were once the most rapidly growing economies in the world. Cozy relationships among politically powerful families that closely control the financial underpinning of a whole nation have resulted in a pattern of bad loans and shaky financial deals. As you can see, the effects of globalization are myriad. One of them is the influence of events you used to ignore. For example, the recent labor strife in Korea may affect the supply lines of automobile and computer chips to Latin America. Currency fluctuations, as recently shown by the Asian currency crisis, can affect business dealings and stock markets across the world. Minor word changes in news reports of progress in the Iraqi food for oil arrangement still causes prices to fluctuate wildly. In addition to increased sensitivity to global changes, organizations seeking to join the ranks of world-class businesses must also realize that these stresses can have significant effects on the power structure of the organization. With the necessity of workers with the new skills and abilities required to develop and run a global, world-class enterprise, there may be increasing importance placed on those with expertise in areas such as information technologies, as well as an understanding of the specifics of the market one is trying to penetrate, and the personal relationships made with foreign customers and suppliers. This greater influence brings greater power, often at the expense of those more established in the organization. This shift in power can cause stresses and strains among all the stakeholders of an organization, including family relationships, as is the case with many closely held companies. What are we to do except perhaps breathe a sigh of relief that we survived? I would suggest that organizations must not only reevaluate their plans, but reevaluate how they make those plans. Unless they do both, organizations risk repeating the same mistakes they made in the past. What I am suggesting here is, if you will, a re-engineering of how you plan your organization's long-term future. We must remember that organizations have a choice as to whether to make modest, incremental changes to their plans or major changes to their plans based on this continued turbulence. Most importantly, however, is that we must change how our organization management thinks about the future, and as a result, change our organizations. They may result in small organizational adjustments or a major reinvention of an enterprise. For example, Westinghouse used to be an appliance maker, but now basically owns CBS, and CBS is Westinghouse, which has a lot to do with making money, but very, very little to do with making refrigerators. A fatal mistake in how most organizations deal with the future is how they assume that they can predict what will happen. Because of this belief, organizations react to what they believe the future will be and make systematic changes based on this future, which, more often than not, is off the mark. But before we go on, let me first provide a definition of strategic planning and management. Strategic planning has two parts. The first part is the development of a long-term plan of an organization's vision, purpose, and capabilities based on what they believe the future to be. The second part, which is just as important, is acting on this vision and purpose and aligning an organization's systems to maximum effect. Strategic planning falls into three broad categories. Past-based future planning, known also as the design school, vision-based models, and scenario-based models. Past-based planning uses extrapolations of the past to predict the future. Vision-based models use a leader-defined vision of where the organization needs to go, sometimes with and sometimes without help or data from others. Scenario-based methods look at alternative futures before taking these steps. Past-based strategic planning was mostly initiated by the great Igor Ansoff. Developed initially in the late 1950s and early 1960s, this model was ideal in an age of continuous economic growth. This model was most often used until the 1970s in divisions of Fortune 500 firms. While theoretically focused on planning, it often amounted to a mechanism the large firms used to control their often rebellious divisions and associates. It was often combined with what's called a SWOT analysis, a business tool popularized by the Boston Consulting Group. The SWOT consists of analyzing an organization's market strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, hence the acronym. As shown in the accompanying graphic, an appraisal of the factors external to the organization is done. Threats and opportunities are identified, and key measures of success are defined by senior management and their staff. In tandem, an appraisal of systems internal to the organization are also assessed. Based on this information, an organization's strategy is supposed to emerge from all this data collection. This strategy is then fine-tuned according to the personal values of the senior management and the necessity of the organization to follow the moral, legal, and ethical responsibilities of society. An implementation plan is then developed. Unfortunately, the basic premise and weakness of this model is that the future will be like the past, and that an organization's strategy will automatically emerge from this enormous data collection effort they undergo. After much criticism and failure, this model was modified by some to include a more personal, subjective touch. Called here the vision-based model, those who used it came to the realization that a strategy just does not emerge from lots of data collecting, but instead must be infused by the energy and feelings of top management. An example of this is the company vision, where management articulates the ideal situation and future for the company. For example, the vision of American Express is to become the total financial service organization for travelers. While popular now, using this method still entails using a single vision of the future, and so is subjected to the negative consequences when the future is not quite how we like it. On the other hand, scenario-based strategic planning does not make these assumptions. Instead, it initially identifies assumptions and beliefs that management has about the future, especially those that could lead them to think that the future will automatically be like the past. In addition, the model evaluates subtle interactions between current trends that might make for sudden changes in the future. Management and their consultants then combine these two threads to create several possible and likely outcomes for the future. Based on these possible outcomes, management creates stories or plots about how these possible futures might play themselves out. Management then creates contingency plans that will be evaluated on an ongoing basis. Depending on how the future unfolds, various aspects of these plans will be implemented. This scenario-based planning can be considered as a front end, if you will, to traditional strategic planning or vision-based planning processes. Though not often used as much as purely vision-based models, scenario planning has had significant effects on strategic planning. Perhaps the best documented case of success was with Shell Corporation that pioneered the method. Because of its use, they alone of all the major oil companies avoided the catastrophic results of the 1973 oil embargo and price increases. Working with different cultures leads to unclarity beyond the usual problems of strategic planning. Although different cultures are characterized by different laws, assumptions, and beliefs, there are also possible markets for you, as your country is for them. While global communications and the emerging global culture have narrowed the differences between people, it would be a fundamental mistake to say these differences have vanished. It is hard enough to discuss complex issues and concerns with someone you know, much less someone from a different culture. We can perhaps recognize confusion in others, that quizzical look of just not understanding another people. This at least is a clear signal that we need to communicate more, or perhaps in a better or different fashion. Unfortunately, mistakes usually arise when we think we understand someone else, but really don't. We then go on, blithely thinking we have an agreement or understanding, but we actually don't. And to make these matters more interesting, in some cultures, the written agreement, sometimes so painfully negotiated, is just a starting point for negotiations. It is certainly beyond the scope of this video conference to discuss all the vagaries and interactions between all the myriad cultures on this earth. I have found it useful, though, in working with different cultures, to evaluate both cultures in general and individuals specifically along 7 dimensions related to their work behavior. I would encourage you to examine both your own and other cultures along these dimensions and engage in a deep and thorough discussion with potential business partners to find out how they and the cultures that they belong to are both similar and different than your own. The purpose of this part of the video conference is not to be a primer on social anthropology, but to be in discussion among yourselves and potential business partners. These dimensions, along with cultures and their members vary, include the degree that work life is a priority for them compared to their individual pursuits. For example, Saudi Arabs often take time off from work to drive their wives and families to shopping centers, something not usually seen in the United States. Timeliness is also another dimension along which these cultures vary. Germans tend to consider punctuality a virtue, while to others it is less important. The degree of emphasis on legal forms and following ethical practices is also another dimension. What may be considered a bribe in some cultures is just another way of doing business in others. People from certain cultures tend to emphasize relationships and insist on a long trust-building process before engaging in business. Those from these cultures tend to focus more on process than outcome. Others, including the United States, focus more on tasks than relationships and are more interested in results than the niceties of getting there. Individuality versus teamwork is another dimension along which cultures vary. The United States and Australia tend to be the most individualistic of countries, while Venezuela, Colombia, Singapore, and Pakistan, among others, tend to be more socially and collectively oriented than most countries. Perhaps the most noted researcher in this area is Hofstede, whose work and related information can be found in the appendix of your participant manuals. Hofstede defined cultures along 4 dimensions. Power distance, defined as the degree of social stratification in society. Uncertainty avoidance, defined as how much uncertainty is accepted or abhorred in a culture. Individualism, defined as how much a culture emphasizes group versus individual achievements. And masculinity-femininity, defined as how much a culture is thing or outcome-oriented versus having a social or relationship emphasis. I would encourage you to thoroughly read Hofstede's work listed in our reference section, along with any and all related books and magazines on the culture that you are interested in. This will not only help you in your business dealing, but will make communication much easier with your potential business partners. Until recently, globalization and Americanization have gone hand in hand, thanks to the dominance of the U.S. entertainment industry and the news media. Mickey Mouse was the first star with a global name. But now the media business, especially television, is becoming increasingly multinational. This trend is accelerated by the efforts to privatize and deregulate this activity worldwide. Both of these developments are driven partly by technological change. For example, digital compression allows between 8 and 12 channels to occupy the same capacity required by a single analog channel. Broadcasting has thus changed from a medium in scarce supply to one with plentiful capacity, thus forcing governments to give up total ownership and control. Culture is local, but the American culture that U.S. television has packaged seems to have a certain universal appeal which may have something to do with America's melting pot of different cultures or its being a country of countries, and with English becoming the primary global tongue. But I must insist that our increasingly cultural commonalities as a global community should not deter us in our pursuit of uniqueness, diversity, and individuality. This is the real strength of our world in terms of business, education, and welfare for all. In future video conferences, we will be discussing the effect of demographics and Generation X in marketing and the media, using benchmarking to gather competitive intelligence, working with multiple cultures using commercial diplomacy, and a variety of other topics that will assist you in developing your organization in this increasingly complex future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chaudron. Let us continue with the second question and answer session. Our first call is from Mexico, from Grupo Sedva, in Tlalnepantla, in the Estado de Mexico.
Please, ¿aló? Adelante. Adelante. According to marketing, what solutions does the strategic planning give the educational institutions that want to open up and go abroad, and what would be our expected success? What could we expect?